Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar. But before we dive into this insightful discussion, we'll just wait for a few more minutes as our audiences join us across the regions and time zones. But meanwhile, please feel free to use the chat feature to introduce yourselves and also let us know where you're joining from, as it will be lovely to know and hear from each one of you. Our chats are overflowing. So, for all those who have joined us, before we begin, I would love to introduce to our leading experts and a panel who has joined us here today. Um, we have Greer, the director at MedTech, Jacob Skinner, regulatory manager at Global Regulatory Services, GRS. We also have Michelle Bonn from BioPortUSA and Mark Lesselroth, CEO and president, of BioPortUSA. So please feel free to say hi and use the reaction feature. You can also, send us some claps and hearts before we dive into this insightful discussion. Well, Mark and Michelle, how's the weather in USA? I mean, it's sunny in the UK, but how's it there?
We actually have sun here today.
Amazing.
We're not located in the same location, but I can too say that for once we actually have a little bit of sun in upstate New York as well. But Saisha, do you want to maybe let us just spend 2 minutes giving a brief background so that the audience knows a little bit about GRS and BioPort?
Definitely. Yes. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Michelle. We'll just begin right away. So once again, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar, Navigating the Evolving Regulatory Landscapes. I am Sakshi, your moderator for today's Fireside Chat, and thank you once again for joining us from across the regions and time zones. This session, as you all know, is designed for startups, SMEs, and MedTech professionals who are actively looking to enter and expand in the EU and the US markets. With regulatory landscapes shifting fast, we all believe that staying informed is no longer a nice to have, but instead it's critical for strategic success. So we're going to explore key developments like the shift from QSR and QMSR in the US, the ongoing changes in the EU MDR and IVDR, and also the impact of recent decisions like the Google's EU first launch of the Pixel Watch 3. So let me introduce you to our fantastic panel of leading experts who brings years of hands-on experience and global insight. So we have Greer. Could you please give a quick introduction and also tell us about your work at MedTech?
Okay, thank you very much, Sakshi, and welcome everyone. It's a true pleasure to speak to you all today and to join this great panel. So I very much hope you enjoy the conversation. So yes, I'm Greer and I'm co-founder director of MedTech, and also of the parent company Global Regulatory Services. So yeah, I split between the two almost, but it makes a good whole approach with regards to MedTech, with GRS based in the UK and MedTech based in Europe. So I have over 30 years experience in the life sciences with pharmaceuticals, combined products and MedTech, very much focusing on regulatory affairs and quality compliance, but how that also interacts with other areas of the industry. So, it's very important that we don't work in silos, that we work together. So I know today is very much a focus on regulatory quality compliance, but also looking at how that integrates with other key areas of the industry. So yeah, I particularly enjoy the very challenging products where it's what is it? Is it a medical device? Is it a combination product? And if so, what other regulations apply? So that's really sort of what I thoroughly enjoy, and I hope I can bring some of that to today's conversation.
Thank you so much. Jacob, could you please give a quick round of introduction and also talk about your work with GRS?
Absolutely. So I'm very honoured to have been invited to be part of the panel on this webinar, and to be joining you from a very warm United Kingdom today. So I'm Jacob Skinner. I'm the Regulatory Operations Manager at Global Regulatory Services. My background is originally in biosciences and then moving into the medical device industry, starting in the design and manufacture of radiotherapy devices. I later moved into regulatory and quality consultancy with Global Regulatory Services, where my main role has been really helping startups, SMEs, and university spin-outs to understand regulation, primarily in the UK and Europe, and develop early regulatory strategies and implement quality management systems to design and develop effective medical devices. Because of my background, I have a special interest in electromechanical devices, but I've also been involved with SAMD medical device software and also digital health technologies as well. And on a day-to-day basis, I also take responsibility for our representation services, providing a role as UK responsible person at Global Regulatory Services, but also as EU authorised representative in our subsidiary company, MedTech.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And moving on to Mark, would you please give us a quick introduction?
Excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone. I too am grateful for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today. My name is Mark Lesleroth. I'm the founder and CEO of BioPortUSA. We're a holistic life science consulting firm that works predominantly with European startups and SMBs to help them with market entry into the US. So not unlike what Greer just mentioned in terms of silos, we recognize that it's important, of course, to get FDA approval, but that's a prerequisite to even begin looking at the US. There's so much more involved in what I consider to be one of the most difficult markets in the United States, not to mention the world, from a navigational standpoint. But I'm happy that we've managed to assemble a team of subject matter experts, one of whom is with us today, Michelle Bonn, who's a regulatory expert. But we've also identified and recruited subject matter experts that deal with reimbursement, or deal with commercialization, or branding, or sales. And as a result, we really can help companies from overseas successfully commercialize their products because we're able to guide and assist them along the way. But today, I'm thrilled that Michelle is able to join us.
Thank you.
I'll just dive right in. I too have a long history, like Greer mentioned, in med device. I've owned and operated 3 companies, and I just recently sold my 3rd company that was a regulatory compliance and engineering firm in the United States. So my background is heavily focused on medical device, pharma, and engineering and quality systems for both med device and pharma manufacturing. But I've also worked with dozens of small companies and universities and many different types of products. I like the more complex ones like Greer because you can dig right in and there's many layers to the regulatory process, which is really important, especially if you're a small company and you want to commercialize, like Mark was saying. One of the most important pieces is having a team intact to help you prep for commercialization, not just regulatory. They go hand in hand if you want to sell globally.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that introduction. Well, let's begin with a quick landscape check-in. The regulatory picture is changing quite quickly, as we all know. Layoffs at the US FDA, evolving tariffs, and continued uncertainty around EU MDR timelines. So let's dive in. Chris, starting with you. What's your take on the EU, like on how the EU is evolving, particularly when it comes to like MDR and IVDR deadlines and tariff pressures?
Yes, thanks, actually. So, yes, well, regulatory, it's in Europe has been quite a journey, let's say. So, yeah, when they first came in, when there was quite a transition period, but even so, the industry still wasn't that prepared to really adhere to or dare I say embrace the new regulations. It was quite a shift. With medical devices, it wasn't such a big shift in terms of engaging with the notified bodies who act on behalf of the competent authorities. But certainly with diagnostic companies, it was a massive shift. The general feeling was that the new regulations would be stifling innovation and that they would be looking elsewhere, basically outside of Europe. And so the natural place to go to would be the US. And that's because with the diagnostic companies, it was the first time that the majority of them were now going to have to engage with a notified body. So pre the new regulations coming in, about 20% of diagnostic companies would need the intervention of a notified body. Post the new regulation coming in, that has switched to 80% needing to engage with a notified body. And so overnight almost, their costs went up massively. And also suddenly they were having to, or it felt sudden, they were having to comply with more stringent regulations. So it was a culture shock. And I think diagnostic companies have been so used to being very dynamic, very flexible, very adaptable, and suddenly felt like that they had one hand behind their backs. And so there is this sense that they're still struggling to change their culture, as it were. But one of the key issues with the new regulations was that we actually didn't have enough notified bodies who were designated, i.e. approved, under the new regulations in order to review technical files, etc., against the new regulations. And so that caused a massive backlog. Now we're in a position now where it's hugely improved. And interesting with what's happened in the US, with the FDA layoffs and the new tariffs and everything, the EU is now looking a lot more attractive than the US. So that has been a switch, because when the new regulations came into Europe, it was definitely a drain off to the US. And even in Ireland, the Irish government were telling their MedTech companies, go to the US, forget Europe. And they were actually providing grants, for them to go to the US and forget Europe. So that is changing now. So which is good, for the patient population in Europe, because there was a real and genuine concern that, you know, innovative product and even existing devices were just going to disappear out of Europe, and that would be to the detriment of patient care. So that wasn't good news, but I think we're seeing a reversal of that trend now.
Thank you for that. And Michelle, from the US perspective, like, what does the QSR to QMSR shift mean for companies navigating the FDA pathway?
It's harmonizing the ISO 1345 with the 21 CFR 820. It's going to cause a lot of documentation requirements that weren't there before. The good news is you won't have two parallel tracks. You won't have to follow ISO 1345 and 820. You can just do one harmonized 1345, but you need to make sure that pieces of the FDA are still incorporated into your quality system. So, for example, design verification or validation and verification will be similar to ISO terms, but FDA definitions will be different because that'll apply to safety and effectiveness. So the biggest, most important part of this change is risk management. And that's going to follow the 1345 principles. So that'll streamline for the manufacturers of med device. And the other really big piece is the complaint handling that still must apply, but it's got to be integrated into your ISO system. And then I would say one of the things you could really start doing early on is a gap assessment. Focus on the big change, which is supplier controls. If you get, you're going to have to make sure that your suppliers meet very specific standards. So that's another big change that's coming.
That's really helpful, Michelle. I'm sure these insights by all of you, all four of you today, it's definitely helping our audiences know better and stay prepared. Jacob, once for you, what challenges or trends are you seeing in MDR implementation, and what do you think, how are companies coping up?
Sorry, I was on mute there. So I think, what a question, really. MDR and IVDR have been hugely challenging for the industry in general. And I think that came in right from the beginning. I mean, the MDR is, you know, a beast of a regulation compared to the previous directive. And the focus on particularly the level of clinical evidence required, the upclassification of a lot of class 1 devices historically to devices that now need full conformity assessment by a notified body, and also an increase in the requirements for quality management systems, have all really impacted manufacturers, both of devices that were previously on the market under the directives, which we call legacy devices, and also for bringing new innovations to market. I mean, without a full history lesson, the regulations were originally published in 2017 and should have applied in May 2020 for the MDR for devices and May 2022 for in vitro diagnostics. But the COVID-19 pandemic that, of course, we experienced in 2020 pushed that initial enforcement date back to May 2021. And since then, there have been these whole raft of various amending regulations that have mainly adjusted the transitional periods and the sell-off provisions of both the regulations. Primarily, the purpose of these has been to facilitate those products which were already on the market under the directive to remain on the market, to both reduce the huge burden and backlog which we saw with notified bodies in terms of getting devices approved, and also to prevent the shortage of critical medical devices. But there were specific requirements attached to those transitional provisions, and recently we've had some critical deadlines there. So back in September of last year, September 2024, was really the last possible date to continue as a product certified under the Medical Device Directive. And there was a requirement by the 26th of September to have a formal written agreement for MDR transition in place with your notified body. So those dates have now passed and manufacturers can no longer take advantage of that route. And we're in a similar position this year for in vitro diagnostics, in that for a lot of IVDD certified devices, that deadline is upcoming in September of this year. So it's really critical that if you do have in vitro diagnostic devices currently on the market, that you want to transition to IVDR, that you are speaking to notified bodies, and really an application should have already been lodged by now because the deadline's upcoming in May, and you need that formal written agreement by September at the latest. But I think primarily here today, we're thinking about new products and new innovations. And for those kind of products, the requirements of the MDR and IVDR have applied from the date of application with a few caveats. So at the moment, we're seeing delays in the rollout of UDAMED, which is the European registration system for medical devices. And that's made up of several modules. Primarily, we have ACTA registration for the registration of manufacturers, of authorized representatives, and the UDI and devices registration module for registration of UDI and devices. And these modules have been available for a while now for voluntary use, but the mandatory use of them has not been rolled out. However, what we're seeing is that when manufacturers are going to a notified body, they're wanting them to have a SRN, which is a single registration number, which you can only get through UDAMED registration. So that sometimes causes a little bit of a problem. And also some of the European competent authorities, as an Irish-based entity, we have a relationship with the HPRA, and therefore our registration has to be through UDAMED because the HPRA have mandated that device and manufacturer economic operator registrations have to be done through UDAMED. So although it's not mandatory, it is being used and it is in place. And then I think the other critical deadlines that are coming up this year are really to do with UDI and the placing of UDI-DI on device packaging. So this has already been mandatory for higher risk class devices, such as class 3, class 2A, class 2B devices for a while. But from May of this year, it's going to come into force for class 1 devices as well. So it's important that manufacturers are thinking about that and addressing it effectively.
Thank you so much. That was quite a good take on the question. And also, like, you've already highlighted a plan of action for anyone who still needs to get on with their preparations. Well, and Mark, as someone who is supporting the US companies entering both markets, what's the biggest concern you're hearing from the ground?
Well, first of all, I just want to reflect on what Jacob, just did a really nice job elaborating on. It sounds like an awful lot of work, and it's taking longer. And to kind of tie things back to what Greer was saying, that clearly before the administration implemented tariffs, I think a lot of people were saying, go west, young man or young woman, meaning the process of getting FDA clearance was, and I think continues to reference, what Jacob just says, continues to be easier than getting MDR, whether it's all the additional hoops that you have to jump through, or most notably, there aren't, what I've been told is there aren't enough notifying bodies. So some people are sitting on a list for 2-3 years, just because there aren't enough. So I can appreciate the anxiety associated with companies that are contemplating market entry into the U.S. Because of some of the administration's acts. But, the truth be told is, even though they have gone back and forth, especially with the FDA, we at BioPort really haven't seen any major disruptions in terms of the FDA filing process, setting up meetings, doing QSub meetings, the application itself, because I think the majority of the reviewers were intact. I did hear where some people, bad luck, somebody left, but on a whole, and since we're talking predominantly with startups, I think today, you're years away from commercialization. And what I mean by that is you really don't have to worry about the Trump tariffs. I almost want to say, and I do say this to prospective clients, it's business as usual. You've got things that you need to take care of long before you even think about selling a product over here. So, don't let American politics be a distraction. I do find myself playing armchair psychologist with a number of prospective clients just to, deal with their anxieties. Because at the end of the day, from a process standpoint, I do think that what we have to offer is still easier to get. And even if you are further along or you can accelerate your commercialization spot, keep in mind that FDA clearance is considered a gold standard in other parts of the world. So if for some reason you decide to, even for personal reasons, not to do business in the United States, you can take your product and go to the Middle East. You can go to certain parts of Southeast Asia. You can go to Australia. Even though they have TGA, they basically accept FDA, 1-to-1. So I do want to point that out, that there are options if for some reason someone doesn't want to come to the U.S. But I'd say for today, you're years away from anything that could impact you that is being done from the administration. I don't see the administration taking even more drastic steps with regards to the FDA and their personnel at this point in time. I think the president has many other much larger problems to deal with. And I think the American healthcare industry as a whole would push back even more, because obviously what he says doesn't just impact the international life science community, but it impacts the US life science community as well. So those are my 2 cents.
So can I just jump in? Sorry, Secretary, can I just jump in there? Because with regards to the tariffs, that has sent ripples through Europe and the UK. And people are concerned. And Mark, you quite rightly said, a lot of these companies being startups are probably years away from actually entering the US market. So hopefully by then things will have settled down. But if they've got a product that is already in the process of being commercialized in the US, I don't know if you've heard anything, but there are concerns of where companies are actually providing components for medical device manufacturers. So they're exporting from wherever, so let's say Europe, UK, into the US, and tariffs are being applied. So then it means that the US manufacturers are paying more because they're taking components from outside of the US. So that is increasing costs if they accept them. And then, but if the company from outside the US providing the components is saying the tariffs are too great for us, and we can increase our prices up to a certain point, but no more, because that's just killing our business. So we're going to have to look elsewhere. So I've had sort of those rumblings going on, and then people are looking at their options. So this is all about your strategy to your overseas markets, whether it's US to Europe, Europe to US, etc. But there are companies who are thinking, okay, let's get rid of the tariff issue in terms of importing product into the US or importing components, and we'll just set up a US company. So is that a solution to set up a US company? I don't know, Mark.
It could be, but I want to make sure that we're separating companies that need to get regulatory approval versus those that don't, right? So I think you're addressing companies that are now actively selling to the US, may already have regulatory approval, or don't because they're components manufacturer, they don't need regulatory approval.
Or very close to regulatory approval.
And yes, there are solutions. Certainly one is to set up operations, but everyone knows, except for perhaps the president, it's not easy to set up, a manufacturing facility, the whole logistics supply chain. It takes time, in some cases, years.
Yeah.
So, the advice that we've given to those companies that are not startups, that are already doing business here, is you can take advantage of these foreign trade zones. And so what happens is that someone would, ship something from wherever they're coming. So this applies to anyone, not just the UK or Europe. And they ship the products into the foreign trade zone. And what that basically avoids is having to pay any of the tariffs up front. You're not getting away from the tariffs, but what happens now is that the tariffs or the taxes are only applied once the product is sold. So they have a relationship with a distributor, let's say. Distributor needs the components or the products. The components or products get sent to a warehouse in this foreign trade zone. And then only when the sale takes place, is the tax applied. And I think that's worth something, because at least the company knows that a sale has taken place, as opposed to shipping it, and hoping that the sale or waiting for the sale to take place could take God knows how long. And then I think it ultimately also comes down to negotiation between the distributor and the parts manufacturer and or the actual medical device. The margins that the distributors have in the United States are pretty high, even for U.S. manufacturers. In some cases, it's up to 50%. So if all of a sudden you're dealing with a country where the tariffs are at 25%, well, gee whiz, Mr. Distributor, maybe you're just going to have to take a little bit less margin and therefore not upset the apple cart too much. Seriously, I mean, the margins are very, very high for U.S. distributors, especially in the medical field. And so I think that knowing what I just shared with you in the audience, that hopefully will put things a little bit more into perspective and a little less, anxiety provoking, because there is room. And as a result, God forbid, the distributor doesn't make so much, because I can tell you one thing: if they're selling to a U.S. hospital, the U.S. hospital certainly is not going to pay more. Unlike the American consumer, for consumer-related goods, where we may have to pay more for toys or whatever the case is, that will not happen. Guaranteed, will not happen in the U.S. healthcare sector, because in part they don't have the money. Mm-hmm. Michelle, do you have anything to add, or?
I agree with that, because hospitals are not for profit. And they was at an event last month, and I was listening to the chief director of the Boston medical system, and he was saying over the next year or two, the main criteria for their operations is to shave cost. That is their goal. So if any company wants to come in and sell a device or a product to a hospital, they better have the number one item being it's less expensive than what's already there, if it's a new product. And then on the flip side, I was going to mention AdvaMed, which is the big trade organization in the United States that advocates for MedTech, has been working diligently in Washington to put the MedTech industry back into a place where there are no tariffs. That's what it has been historically for the last 25 years. I'm not sure of the number, but they're pushing towards that once again. And I don't know where that stands yet, but they've been having conversations with Washington to try to remediate that. And I don't know how it will turn out. My guess is there will be some back and forth negotiation to bring the tariffs down lower than what's being charged now on most products. So that's a light.
It's really great to get your viewpoint from the US, boots on the ground, because I can tell you, even the UK government, there feels like there's a certain element of panic, because they have posted saying for UK companies, we can provide you with help in order to deal with the tariffs being enforced by the US. So that sort of like stirs a little bit of panic over the pond over here rather than the US. So it's great to have your view on this. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's not ideal. Nobody wants these tariffs. It's out of nowhere, really.
Yeah.
But our trade organizations here are pushing to help.
Yeah, great. So if there are British companies on this call today, I do have some information. If you're seeking support, I'm happy to share that afterwards. If you email us after the webinar. Thanks.
That was indeed quite an interesting snapshot on the regulatory landscape. Well, let's move on to a very interesting case study, the Google Pixel Watch 3. This was a notable shift and launching in the EU before the US. And it's not just a tech story, as we know, it's a strategic regulatory decision. So, Greer, why do you think this EU first route was chosen, and what does it tell us about the regulatory readiness in the EU?
So I think, we look at the US and it's a big market. We look at Europe, and if you look at the different independent member states, then individual member states, then you think that, well, that's not much a big market. But Europe as a whole is a big market, include UK in that. Then it comes slightly bigger, not massively, but slightly bigger. So, it still can punch its weight. The other thing, though, is if you're a European-based entity, you can get certificates of free sale, which opens up doors in other territories. So really, when you're looking at Europe first versus US first, you're actually looking at what is it that if I go to Europe first, how does that impact on my global strategy? So looking at, what is your long-term objective? Do you want to go beyond Europe and the US? So this is where I was mentioning earlier about don't just look at regulatory and quality compliance, but look at your target markets and their accessibility. So it's reviewing the accessibility and it's, do they want your product as well? So, but yeah, your certificates of free sale will allow a company to expand fairly readily across the world. So there will be some nuances that you'll need to meet per country, but that's fairly straightforward. And the other advantage, which you could say the same with the US as well, is that many countries do follow the EU style regulations now. And so when you comply with the EU regulations, it actually sets you up really well to then comply with the regulations and compliance requirements for other territories. But that shouldn't be the be all and end all, when you're looking at your target markets. And then one thing that's quite critical, I believe, is actually the clinical requirements. So the clinical requirements in Europe actually lend themselves well to entering other markets. And I've just got a few notes because I just want to make sure I'm absolutely spot on this. So there's more flexibility in the early stages of clinical evidence requirements. And the advantages under the EU MDR is that you can actually justify safety and performance through clinical equivalence to existing devices. Okay. In the US, my understanding is, especially for the PMA submissions, that that generally requires very large, statistically significant clinical trials before being given approval. So here the EU potentially has an edge over the US. So advantages for the Europe with the clinical is potentially you avoid large pre-market trials if sufficient equivalence is demonstrated. And then that means you get faster CE marking for your devices, which means you're on the market sooner. And there's lower, earlier clinical development costs. So not a huge amount upfront necessarily. And then also you can use post-market clinical data, which will then strengthen a US submission. because Europe requires companies to maintain their CE marks through post-market clinical follow-up. And this offers a legal and structured way to collect real-world clinical performance data. And that data then can be used to support the FDA submissions. So, and another tick for Europe. And again, even though the new European regulations are strict and stringent, can be that the CE mark, obtaining a CE mark is faster than the US, assuming that the US approach is via the PMA regulatory pathway. So it then means that a European launch means that companies will get an earlier return on their investment, which then they can invest back into the company to launch into the US. So cash flow is king, but cash flow is a benefit in those circumstances.
I agree with a lot of everything you said, really. The thing with the PMA in the US, if in general, it takes about 5 years to start collecting all of that data and that clinical evidence. So for a US company to come here, or sorry, a foreign company to come to the US in a regulated space like this, you're going to need at least 5 million to cover. And it's probably more because you're going to have to provide all that clinical evidence. So if you can do that sooner in Europe and plan and say, listen, we're going to go to the States in 4 years, you would say, this is how we're going to collect the data in Europe. And we need to make sure it's acceptable to the FDA. So sometimes working with a US entity during that process, we can help do a pre-submission meeting to see where you would stand on your data collection and your clinical to make sure that your strategies align.
Exactly, good point, Michelle. And this is what we say to people is that, again, going back to my favorite buzzword at the moment, silos, is, you know, when you're looking at your European expansion, think about your other target markets. If it's a US, then you've got to be planning for the US at the same time, so that you're not reinventing the wheel. So don't do Europe and then go, right, now I'm going to the US. And then you're having to redo your studies, for example, or create new data because you haven't actually factored in the US requirements. So really important to get that strategy spot on, or as good as you can get.
Right.
And the Q subs with the FDA, perfect, yeah.
And an important thing to note is when you're selling in Europe and then you want to sell in the US, if you're going to use data that you collected in the US, you have to make sure it's on the same commercial ready device that you would sell in the United States. So you cannot switch the device characteristics if you're going to use that same data collection and carry it over.
Good point, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. That does bring another question for you, Michelle. From a US standpoint, does this reflect growing hesitation about the FDA timelines?
The timelines may extend just because we have a shortage of staff, as Mark was saying. Many of the reviewers are stayed on at the FDA, but the issues behind the scenes where people were supporting the reviewers may cause delays. So we don't know what that's going to look like. I echo Mark's thoughts on we must keep going as if there is no change, because if you stop, that's only going to cause more delay. So things will level out here. We just don't know where it'll end, but the regulatory processes likely will not change. There might be they might pull some of the requirements back, which could be a benefit. Right now, the audits that are happening in the United States are dwindling because they don't have enough staff to take care of the auditing requirements that have to happen. So it's kind of like roulette. We don't know where it's going to land. What else can I explain about that to help?
Um,
Maybe
sure.
not.
I mean,
Yeah,
it
shows the
true.
complexity of the subject.
Oh, it's unbelievable. There's so much going on. And my hope is that AdvaMed really can reduce those tariffs, because you can't, we're all patients of these products, every single one of us. So we'll see how that goes. Mark might have some thoughts on that too, which I'm sure he will.
Mark, would you
To
like
be
to add anything?
well, to be determined. I mean, the one thing I did want to add, I was just looking at some stats here, and I should have looked at this sooner, as to, why did Google decide to go to Europe first? And I think regulatory may have had something to do with it, but I think the bigger reason is, Apple isn't as dominant in Europe. It's more of the competitive landscape. And so, and that's my advice I give to all my clients too, is like, look at where your competition is, and more importantly, look at where they're not. So I have to believe that some of the decision-making processes to, why launch the Google Pixel Watch in Europe first really has a lot to do with the fact that Apple's dominance in Europe isn't quite as strong as it is in the United States. The statistics prove it. I was just looking, I mean, there's about 30 million Apple, I thought it'd be a lot more, but there's about 30 million Apple Watch users in the United States. There's 10 million Google Pixel users in the United States. Apparently in Europe, which I really find hard, they have a hard time nailing down because they don't make the stats available, but supposedly it's like around 1 million or less than 1 million Apple users in Europe. Apple Watch users, but there seems to be significantly, yeah, I know, it's what I thought. I'm like, how's that really possible? But there are apparently more Google Watch users, or people who are more in sync with Google or Google phones, because obviously, they go sync hand in hand with a phone as well. So, I don't mean to disparage the whole regulatory process. I think it plays a role, but I don't think that was the reason why. I think it was really, let's go, where Apple hasn't been as dominant yet, and take a shot at this. So.
Thank you for that. And Jacob, before we move on to the next set of our questions, as we were discussing earlier about the regulatory readiness in the EU, according to you, how do you interpret this move from an EU compliance lens?
Okay, so just want to take a quick step back as well to the original question about the strategic decision taken by Google. And I think Mark has made a very good point there, because the Google Watch is different to a lot of MedTech, right? Because it's direct to consumer, it's direct to customer. You're not selling it to hospitals or clinics, or, it's a choice which is often taken around, personal decisions, whether you prefer Apple or Google or the iPhone or a Pixel. So it's a little bit different to a lot of MedTech there. But first and foremost, I think when you're choosing any market, as a startup or an SME, what do you want to know? Is there actually a market for your product? And is my product actually going to sell in the target market, whether that's the US or the EU? So legitimately, I think there's no right or wrong answer to the question of EU or US first. It has to be a commercial decision based on regulatory, but also on market research, sales forecasts, costs of doing business, and everything else that is relevant in getting a device to market. Because after all, achieving that regulatory compliance grants you the market access, but it doesn't guarantee there's going to be any form of commercial success. And especially in Europe, the EU MDR is implemented as a common regulation. So achieving EU MDR certification, applying the CE mark, gives you access to all of those European markets. But every single one of those markets has a unique healthcare system, a unique political situation, economic situation, and cultural context. So there's a whole mix of different insurance-based healthcare systems, publicly financed healthcare systems that are all really changing the way that you're going to bring a product to market. But if you do that commercial market research and you take the decision to say, okay, we want to go to the EU, we want to achieve EU MDR or IVDR, then the first thing you need to be thinking about is a regulatory strategy. And that is going to be very dependent on your intended use statement, on the classification of your product, whether you can self-certify as a class 1, whether you need to go through a formal conformity assessment process if you're a 2A or a 2B or a class 3 device. But regardless of that, you're going to need to implement a quality management system. And it's better, in my view, to start that process as early as possible. So an effective quality management system will ensure that the development of your device meets those regulatory requirements. In those early design control activities, you're going to identify the applicable general safety and performance requirements. You're going to find any harmonized standards that you can use as a demonstration of conformity. And you're also going to develop an effective strategy for generating clinical data. And as Greer mentioned earlier, the clinical development under EU MDR is particularly important. And I know there was some mention of claiming equivalence. In most cases now, that is a very challenging route to market because the MDR requires us to demonstrate clinical, technical, and biological equivalence. And generally, and this is different to the way it was under the previous directives, this requires access to the technical documentation of the equivalent device. So if that device is a competitor or a other random device on the market, it's going to be very difficult to get that information. Then you also need to think about whether you need to run a pre-market clinical investigation. And that's significant investment, both time and financial. It requires detailed planning. So that all needs to be costed in the timelines of getting your device to market. Once you've got all of that in place, you've completed your design and development, you've verified the design, you're then going to have to go through a conformity assessment process if you are a 2A device or above. And that's going to be an assessment of your quality management system and a technical documentation review. And there are, as Mark alluded to earlier, delays with getting a European notified body at the moment. Most notified bodies at the moment do have capacity, but they are expecting another bottleneck in future just because of the delays in manufacturers being ready for conformity assessment. So particularly as we get to the end of the MDD to MDR transition period in 2027, I'd imagine there will be another large bottleneck of notified body capacity that will need to be looked at and addressed. So the recommendation is to get in the notified body queue really 18 months ahead of when you want that conformity assessment to be carried out.
I don't know if this is going to work. I just wanted to kind of follow up on what Jacob says with a slide I have here with just general questions that people should ask. And then, can you see my slide here?
No, we can see us.
Just us.
In duplicate.
So yeah, no, my apologies. So I want to understand. Let's stop sharing here. If not, I'll just read it off. I think I stopped sharing. Yes.
Not quite.
Would you like to?
There you go.
So
try again?
yeah, no. So here's some questions that I feel like I put this up and I can make this available, to whoever would like it. But questions you need to ask before entering the U.S. healthcare market. 1, have I developed a solution for which there is no problem? Now that applies to American-based companies too. You've got a lot of people who are smart scientists at universities or hospitals, and they're tinkering on something, but they truly may have developed a solution for which there is no readily problem at this point in time. And that's something that the company needs to recognize. 2, what is the compelling need or pain your product will solve? I think what happens all too often is that the developers of new technology are so focused on the science of it, which is understandable, that they're not necessarily looking at the business applications. So, what is this going to solve if it is required? 3, How will your technology improve healthcare providers' decision-making process, patient outcomes, and here it comes, lower costs? As Michelle said earlier, I mean, unfortunately, in the United States, which is, fueled based on capitalism, it's about money. We don't have a universal healthcare system like the most of Europe, and so it's understandable why our European counterparts are, looking at things a little bit differently than we are. Another question is, how's your product different than that of the competition? I've had companies come up to me and says, we have no competition in Europe. And I go, yeah, but let's do some market research in the United States. And all of a sudden it turns out they have 3 or 7 or 10. You can't go into this blind. Doing some preliminary secondary market research, I think, is important, as was mentioned earlier. Another big thing to look at is, what's your reimbursement strategy? So while we're talking about regulatory, which is clearly, I said earlier, it's a prerequisite. Without it, you can't do anything. But what good is having FDA clearance if your product is not reimbursable? No one's going to buy it. End of discussion. It's that simple. And then, I talk about, what is your go-to-market plan? What is your story? Meaning, we Americans, we love stories. So I'm talking about the brand. What does your brand stand for? How are you promoting the product to the intended target audience? How are you aligning yourself with KOLs? Because we're more, I think mankind, not just the US, is a society of followers, not leaders. And then last but not least, do you have the necessary resources? All too often, I meet startups that just don't have the funding or the people in place. So, at the end of the day, check these things off before you venture across the pond and spend a whole lot of money, some of which you may not have, in order to see whether or not there's even, a viable market for you here.
Yep. I want to add to this. One of the things you mentioned on the commercialization is, one of the things that's really important to that commercialization is intellectual property. And it's critical in the United States. And medical devices are notorious for not having revenue for a number of years before they sell, because you've got to do the clinical and the regulatory. And to have a tight IP strategy so you can raise the money to get your product to market is critical. And one of the reasons why I say that is because MedTech doesn't have the same life cycle like pharma does. Pharma has a patent on a drug that lasts 10 years. For MedTech, you're lucky to get 5 years before someone comes in and starts mimicking your product, taking it over, and selling, the big guys selling your product line. So the tighter your IP and the stronger your team is before you step into the US, the better off you are. And your team doesn't have to be everybody full time. You just need to have the right people in place to help you get your product out there, because as Mark said, regulatory is only one step. And Jake, everyone mentioned this. That's the requirement to sell your product. But the next step is IP and commercialization. And without those two in place, your regulatory won't mean anything. So make sure you have a tight team that covers commercialization, IP, design, control, and regulatory and clinical.
A good point, Michelle. I was going to bring it up later on in the discussion. The only follow-up or the addition I'd say to that is, the other reason to do an IP landscape or a freedom to operate is to make sure that you're not infringing on an American's medical devices product.
Yeah.
Because the first thing the American competitor will do if they feel the heat from you is they're going to go to their legal team or their outside law firm, and they're going to say, please take a look at the patent that they may have registered or something. And if they see an infringement on theirs, guess what?
Litigation.
And even you're done, right? You're not going anywhere. Some of you may recall last year, shame on Apple, but the Apple Watch was caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Now, Apple's a big company, and ultimately they settled for, I don't know how many millions of dollars for having, and forgive me for not remembering the name of the company, but they did. Some of their technology did infringe on another company's technology, and without, acknowledging it, paying them royalties or what have you. So Michelle brings up a really good point. It doesn't cost that much. It doesn't take that long, but it's an oh so important step as you go through your evaluation process of, go, no go into the United States.
Thank you so much. I think the set of questions, Mark, that was really helpful. And I think the sense of direction that you have shared here and the action plan is quite interesting. Well, let's move on to the adaptability. So when we talk about adaptability, with the QMSR transition in the US and the MDR and IVDR challenges in the EU, how can companies stay agile and compliant? So Jacob, starting with you, what are the steps, according to you, that EU-based manufacturers can take to stay ahead?
So I think first and foremost, regulatory strategy is incredibly important from the outset, alongside a robust commercial strategy, as we've all already mentioned. But just in terms of the real considerations and barriers right now that you need to consider in the EU, I think notified body capacity is one of them. So that comes down to finding the right notified body for your product and then securing a slot with them for review well in advance. Beyond that, also be aware of new regulations and new acts which are impacting medical device development right now. So we've fairly recently had the AI Act, and the AI Act has had an impact on any medical device software that incorporates AI. And there's a real need to map the requirements of the new EU AI Act into both your medical device QMS as a medical device manufacturer and also into the technical documentation for an MDR submission. There's also been recently the Cyber Resilience Act as well in the EU, and that will be coming into force with obligations applying over the next few years. And that again, for medical devices, particularly software as a medical device, imposes new cybersecurity requirements for connected products which are used within healthcare. So again, find out which standards you need to meet, make sure that you've addressed those requirements. And from a strategic perspective, regulatory intelligence, that's what it comes down to. Know what regulation applies to your product first and foremost, monitor it. When there's updates, address them. And then also plan for resources. Make sure that you've got enough funding to go through the process. Make sure that you've got investors which understand the medical device industry. And I know Michelle mentioned this because you're going to have to spend a lot of money before you get any return on investment. You need to be prepared to spend well into the millions before you're going to get something with regulatory approval that you're ready to sell that's making any money back. And a lot of investors that aren't familiar with medical devices are just not going to be prepared for that level of risk and are just not going to give you the money you need, and then you'll end up stuck. And unfortunately, I've seen this happen with previous clients where they don't have the right investment, and all the investor wants to see is sell, sell, sell. We need money coming in. We need to make something from this, but they can't sell because they don't have regulatory approval, and they're still 12 months away and $1 million plus in funding away from having anything which they can make any return on, and it just kills the product completely and kills the company. So something to look out for.
Definitely. And thank you for that, Jacob. And Michelle, are you seeing any best practices from the US companies that are dealing with these shifts?
With respect to raising money, I would say, well, if you are going to sell in the US and raise funds, you need to, just like Jacob said, identify the right investor. And we had a client last year who received $3 million in funding for their product. And we set them up for a pre-sub. And with all of the questions, the FDA came back and said, no, 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 not a proficient strategy. So she was a person that was pushing like an entrepreneur does to get the product to market. But what happened was the messaging to the investors was not clear. There was no backup plan. There was no strategy of, okay, if the FDA doesn't accept this, then how do we iterate? And she had a regulatory plan, but it was taking a lot longer, and the investors wanted money fast. So if you don't tell the story to your investors soon, this is med device, this may delay us for 8 months, and if it does, this is what we're going to do. So you, aside from your planning, you're building your product, your regulatory strategy, you also have to tell the investors, this is what we're going to do if part A takes too long. And this is how we're going to use the money. So commercialization, fundraising, and regulatory are all part of the same package.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And Mark, according to you, like, what should companies be building? Like those companies that are building dual market strategies, what should they keep in mind?
So here again, I have a list. My little checklist here. Some of it we've already discussed, but I think first and foremost, in order to de-risk market entry, and I think it's important. I don't think any of us have used the word de-risk, but it's been my experience that a lot of the Europeans are very risk averse, which I can appreciate to some extent. But if you're an entrepreneur, it kind of goes with the territory. You have to be willing to take some risk. But at BioPort, we want to help our prospective clients manage that risk. Because in the end, if you do it right, you can wind up spending a lot of money. So one of the first things that we suggest to anyone is do what we call an opportunity assessment. And what we do there is we line up conversations with 5 of the intended target audience. Let's say it's 5 radiologists, for example. And we have the client talk to them about their product, their technology, just to get some feedback. And if 4 out of the 5 people go, wow, that is really great, then we think that's good enough. It's not statistically valid, but we think it's good enough to move forward. And it doesn't cost that much to do that. If 4 out of the 5 go, no way, it's still, it's ultimately up to the client, but we tend to then suggest, what, maybe this particular technology is just not meant for the US market. Assuming that it is, and what I'm describing here is, a perfect scenario of which I can tell you none of my clients have followed, unfortunately, but the next step would be to do that secondary market research, just to get a picture of the landscape. How big is the market? Who's the competition? Where do we did this for a Canadian company because America is a big country, and it turns out that for their particular product, they really only needed to focus on 7 US states. So that's important from a commercialization standpoint. If the client felt they needed more information, we would push to do some primary market research. So it's a follow-up to the opportunity assessment, but now it's in a more organized fashion, and the client gets the even more detailed information. At that point in time, ideally, what we then would recommend, we may do the IP analysis as well, as Michelle pointed out earlier. But at that point in time, we would recommend to let us develop a commercialization plan. Because the commercialization plan, I think, is the equivalent to, hiring an architect to draft a blueprint to build your house. You would never build a house without having the blueprints. Unfortunately, a lot of companies that I've encountered, both American and foreign, don't have this. And, Michelle mentioned earlier, having an investor of $3 million wanting to have a return on investment, as enthusiastic as the entrepreneur may be, I think the investor really would appreciate seeing a plan that has a timeline in it. It has milestones of what to achieve in a certain time frame. and it has costs. How much is it going to, and these are ballpark numbers, but how much is it going to cost for me to get from point A to point B? Over what time frame? Keeping in mind that, this is what it would look like if there are no bumps in the road. If there is a bump in the road, which can happen, as Michelle just alluded to, it's still something that can be then incorporated into the commercialization plan. What impact is that going to have then, moving forward? We even go as far as to put in a pro forma P&L. So for the investor, they go, aha, when things do get going, we can get a general idea of the projected expenses, as well as obviously the income that this particular product can do. We then look at, what is the path to market? How many of these entrepreneurs are actually going to go to market under their own brand name, or are they ultimately going to look for a strategic partner, meaning a large medical device company, be it a Medtronic or a Boston Scientific or a BD or whoever? We're pretty good at that in terms of matchmaking, but that'll influence the commercialization strategy as well in terms of how you go. And if you do go onto the market on your own, we help them look at, what makes the most sense from a distribution standpoint. Who are the right distributors? What about your brand? Nobody really seems to look at that. But again, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we Americans are influenced by brands, especially in the medical industry. And who are your key opinion leaders? Do you know how to sell to, let's say, again, I'll pick on a hospital. I've seen over the last couple of years some contingencies coming from the UK to the United States. They get all excited. They visit, with Duke Medical Center or some large hospital network, and they meet with the chief of the department, depending whatever therapeutic area it is, and he thinks or she thinks it's wonderful. And they go back to the UK and they go, this is great. At no point in time, though, did they think about talking to someone, let's say, in the IT department, if they have developed, a software, or did they talk to someone on the value analysis committee? This is a committee that most hospitals have that are the ultimate decision makers when it comes to, is your product going to be something that is viable for the hospital? So again, we're getting more away from the science of it and more, and moving into the business end of it, which ultimately it is a business. And I think these are things that the traditional entrepreneur, be it an American or an international, don't always think of. So we've taken upon ourselves to create this checklist, which again, I'd be more than happy to share with your viewers, if they're so inclined to after the presentation.
Thank you so much. That was quite, again, a very interesting take on adapting to regulatory change. To all our audiences here today, please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat feature to put in your questions or any queries. We do have some leading experts here, and they're ready to answer your questions. And we're nearly almost wrapping up our discussion. But before we do that, we would love to have each one of our panel members share one key takeaway or a piece of advice for our audience that may be something really short and actionable. So starting with Greer, would you like to share any piece of advice or a quick takeaway?
I think for any company with a new innovative product, or it's a new company anyway, being slightly biased, a regulatory strategy absolutely is the optimum solution, but it needs to be something that feeds into the overall business plan, and to have a strategy that is flexible enough to adapt to any future changes in the regulations should it take longer than you anticipate to actually go through the process.
Thank you so much. Jacob, would you like to share a piece of advice?
Yeah, of course. This might sound like a silly one, but really understand your product. Understand what the clinical benefit is and what you say it is. Understand any performance claims you want to make, and develop a really robust device description and intended purpose statement, because everything from that first point onwards is based on that, your whole strategy. Everything grows from that point. And if you change that later down the line, if you pivot, then the cost of change increases tremendously the further down that development cycle that you get.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Mark, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Do your homework, right? I mean, find out, make sure that there really is a need for the product. Find out what, it'll take to sell the product, both whether it's an influencer, i.e. the physician or the value analysis committee. So the two examples I'm going to leave the audience with, on the physician side, make sure that you have done a clinical study that provides the kind of data that the doctor is looking for, so that he or she can feel reassured that your technology does what it says it's supposed to do. On the value analysis committee, you should do what's called a healthcare economics study. It costs a little bit of money, but if you do that, you can prove to them black on white on paper, here's why the hospital would benefit from utilizing our product. So I think those are, two takeaways that the audience should really think about with regards to trying to do business in the U.S. healthcare market.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Michelle, can we have a piece of advice?
Everything that this team said is critical. And two things, make sure that the claims on your product are claims that the hospital systems or the physicians care about. Because if you're making a claim that they don't care about, they won't want the device. And then on the flip side, make sure you have a solid team with you to get this product to market, because that's what investors, practitioners, and the market wants to see. They want to see that there's competency behind the product as well.
So I see there's a question here from Albert. Healthcare assessment, you said. So it's a healthcare economic assessment where you have a team of specialists who go in and look at how the hospital or the department is currently doing a certain procedure, for example, and then you do a comparative analysis to see how this new technology, if integrated into the system, would ultimately save money. I mean, in hospitals, it used to be about making money or saving money. And after COVID, I can tell you, at least in the United States, it's really come down to how do we save money. And so that's where this assessment, I think, is really vital, because it will help position your technology in a way that will show others other than the healthcare provider, because in this analysis committee, you also have people who have other operational responsibilities, including, maybe even the CFO. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, and just to add there that these assessments are also becoming more mainstream in Europe. So it's a good idea to do it.
Thank you
Any
so
other
much.
questions?
Well, while our audiences, while they can use the chat feature to put down their questions and queries, we do have a few set of questions to ask our panel. Do you find that the landscape has changed since the release of the UK specific guidance?
I think that's a good one for Jacob to answer, if you don't mind me nominating you, Jacob.
So this is for, primarily in this webinar, we've been discussing the EU and US regulatory landscape. Of course, the UK regulatory landscape is a different one altogether. When the UK left Europe in Brexit, we adapted the previous EU directives under the UK medical device regulation. And later on, it was decided to continually accept European CE marking up until 2030 at least. And we don't know if that's going to extend beyond that date at the moment. We've also had various announcements lately around international recognition. So it looks like the MHRA is looking in future to recognize devices which have been cleared by comparable regulatory authorities. So the FDA you mentioned there for FDA cleared devices, the TGA in Australia and Health Canada. And then most importantly, we are due very soon, in hopefully towards the end of Q2 or Q3 of this year, a first draft of the revised UK medical device regulation, which will be a statutory instrument amending the UK MDR. And that will really give us a much better idea of what the future regulatory landscape looks like for medical devices in the UK.
Thank you so much, Jacob. We do have a question in the chat from Richard. For US, ultimately less enforcement and push for quicker reviews with less staff, less science, devices will be less safe. What's the impact and credibility of US clearances?
I'll take that one. That is a possibility. That really is. I would say just continue to keep a hold of that design control file. Your design file is critical, and just keep to the science on that, which again ties to your team. Make sure you have somebody who's diligently on that design file, so that when you're submitting your data, you know it's safe and effective. You're going to have to police yourself a little bit, and I know that's not always the best answer, but you really will, because even if there's less burden on the clearance, the after effect is still going to hit a company. You still may run into getting 483s and warning letters and product recall. That doesn't go away, and you're still responsible for all of that. So if you try to skirt through the FDA quickly, you're likely to be hit later, which is ultimately worse because it costs more money and more time and patient risk. So I wouldn't look at that as potential for getting through quickly and it being great for the economy. You still have to follow safety and efficacy.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yes, we do have a follow-up question. With the general nature of 13485, a QMSR, what impact will it have on enforcement? For that matter, are there any MDR enforcement data? Isn't it the 510K process therefore the way to go? Any thoughts on efficiency? Is it going to be cheaper? Do we have any thoughts on that?
For MDR versus FDA 510K? Is that I just need a little bit more clarity on that.
Richard, if you could please elaborate your question, that'll be really helpful for our panel. Meanwhile, we do have another question. So when we talk about US first or the EU first, what are your thoughts on how big is the gap?
I'll take that initially, and if anyone wants to contribute, that'd be great. So I actually don't think it's a gap as such. I think it's more about understanding the differences between the markets and what your goal is, and feeding that into your strategy. So and it's being mindful of, like we were talking earlier in this discussion about tariffs, will they really apply to you when you're ready to be on the market in 5 years' time? Who knows? But perhaps you should be, as a contingency, building that into your planning process. So I don't think it's really a gap. It's really is looking at your approach to those markets and whether there is in fact a market for you, and then you can build on that. On the basis of what Jacob said earlier, is at really nailing down what your intended use is for the device and your target population, because everything's going to follow on from that. And the other thing is that it's so many entrepreneurs, their passion is fantastic. They're like children in a sweetie shop. They want all the sweets in one go. But actually, when it comes to MedTech, be focused, concentrate on just one aspect that your device can address, focus on that and take that through the process. And then once you've gone through the clearance or approval process, you can then further develop that product so you can extend the indication to something else and build that. So then you end up being a company that has a portfolio of products rather than one single device. It just makes it easier then to plan and provide the evidence that's needed to support the single claim that you're making.
I agree with Greer. The only thing I would add to, it's not a gap, but in your strategic, thinking, choose one or the other. I've had a couple of clients who've gone down a dual path, and I don't want to say it's impossible, but it costs a lot more money and takes a lot more time. And I think they tend to go down a parallel path of MDR and FDA because they think that they're covering their bases, so to speak. But there are other things that they should be doing in terms of understanding the market, understanding the needs of the market, to really be the determining factor, which pathway from a regulatory standpoint they should go down first. I just don't think for startups in particular, it makes a whole lot of sense to go down a dual path because of both the capital expenditures and the human resources it requires. This is not easy.
Thank you, Greer. Thank you, Mark. Richard, you can unmute and ask a question if that's okay.
Yeah, my question was mostly concerned with the quality management systems required to support both of these regulatory paths. And it was always a question when the QMSR was originally introduced. And my training was always, the 1345 is a standard, and you're kind of in a partnership with your notified body, where the 820 was a law, much like the MDR, and enforceable. Now, the way the new law is written, how enforceable is that, and then for that matter, how much enforcement has been happening with the MDR, short of like catastrophic, marketplace interruptions?
Who wants to take that one? I think it's two people really on this one. From the US side, the QMSR is still in its phase of executing. So, yeah. But that will be the regulation, and it will be mostly based on 1345 with 820 elements intertwined, and that will be the regulation that must be followed. And it will be consistent, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jacob and Greer, it will be consistent with MDR.
Well, the MDR adds additional QMS requirements to the 13485 standard 2. So primarily in Article 10, the QMS requirements for the MDR are set out, but actually all the way through the MDR in the various articles and annexes, there are additional requirements which need to be incorporated into a quality management system. So generally when a notified body performs a QMS audit, they are not just looking at ISO 13485, but also an MDR compliant QMS.
So it'll be similar in the US, but it will be called the QMSR, and it will incorporate the Part 820 items in with 1345, and it will be one documented standard.
Okay, so we're getting, for 1345, we get non-conformances, major, minor, whatever. And we address it with a notified body. How enforceable is that from a legal standpoint, reporting up? Is there any kind of data that exists in people that have completed MDR are getting enforcement actions taken against those companies by the EU or the UK?
Well, I can give you an example. Obviously, I won't be mentioning any names, but there was a company, a client of ours, not long after COVID shutdown, and they had major non-conformancies against them with regards to their quality management system. And it was so bad that the competent authority was going to shut them down. So they gave them a very tight timeline to turn things around. As it was, they didn't manage to achieve to turn everything around in the tight timeline, but they managed to demonstrate enough with our support to show that they were committed, and so to making these changes. And so the competent authority was happy with that. They came back again later, a few weeks later after that, and then I think they left it 2 or 3 months, came back again to monitor the process. That company has now survived, and having been relatively new to the market when we were supporting them, and this was, we had a team of 8 people, consultants working with this company, and we worked all day, evenings, weekends, and bank holidays. It was actually over the Christmas New Year period to get this done and dusted. And that company not only has survived the process, but now is a multi-billion-dollar business. So there is enforcement, and that's a personal example that I can provide to you.
I would also say never make the assumption that the enforcement isn't there.
Does that help you, Richard?
Yeah, I've just been involved with companies that have challenged enforcements, let's say. Large companies, I don't work presently, but that have challenged enforcement and, just the writing of the law. And that seems to be some of the strategy that I've heard coming out to those companies within QMSR.
I think invariably what happens is it's not an if, it's a when, but that when could be quite a way down the line.
Yeah.
Thank you, Reed. Thank you, Richard. Oh, yes, Richard, go ahead.
And then just to my second question. So with all of this stuff stated with the MDR and the increased requirements for upfront data, with the increased requirements for upfront data, is the 510K not the way to go then?
I think, again, it depends on which country you're targeting for sale. But that would be a personal decision. Is this something that's going to treat the US population more effectively than the European? I mean, is there a greater incidence of whatever you're trying to resolve? Is that problem greater in the US or Europe? It's really going to depend on the need. And
you've also got to establish whether the 510K route is even viable for your product, because it may not be.
Might not be.
Well, I'm sure everyone may have follow-up questions, but we need to end the session as well. But please don't worry, we do have the email IDs for free one-to-one discovery calls. So please do connect with our panel members on LinkedIn, and I'm sure they're very happy for you to just reach out to them and connect with them. So yes, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our panel, Greer, Jacob, Mark, and Michelle for such an insightful discussion. I'm sure everyone who attended here would have taken loads of takeaways. Once again, massive thank you to all our attendees who have joined us from across the regions. We hope you're leaving with a clearer direction and also useful ideas on how to navigate the evolving regulatory landscapes in both the US and the EU. Please keep an eye out on the post-event follow-up, and we also hope to see you in our future sessions. Like we mentioned, do follow MedTech BioPortUSA on LinkedIn, connect with the panel members, and reach out to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.